Eu sou o Marcos Mazzi, gerente executivo de autoatendimento da TecBan. O Open TecBan surgiu para conectar pessoas, para a gente falar e discutir um pouco sobre inovação, soluções financeiras, discutir um pouco sobre esse ecossistema. Gostaria de agradecer a audiência de todos vocês pela situação que enfrentamos. Esse evento é totalmente online. Estaremos aí logo conectando com a Inglaterra para um grupo de especialistas da IBR que vai nos falar sobre o que está acontecendo no mundo nesse pós-pandemia aí, nesse momento. Um ponto importante é a TecBan está fazendo esse ano 38 anos. A TecBan tem como essência conectar pessoas, desenvolver soluções tecnológicas inovadoras e olhar para esse ecossistema do mercado financeiro e do autoatendimento. O ARBR é um grupo de especialistas, como eu comentei, eles vão dar um overview aí nesse mercado. Nós vamos falar sobre Open Banking, um assunto que no Brasil está sendo muito discutido e em outros países também. Nós vamos falar sobre o impacto da pandemia, tanto para o consumidor quanto para o sistema financeiro aí nesse ecossistema. Vamos falar de outros assuntos importantes para nos trazer um pouco aí de insights e facilitar aí nas nossas tomadas de decisão, dada a situação que nós estamos passando. Então, vou chamar diretamente da Inglaterra, Dominique. Dominique é o diretor da RBR e, conjunto com a sua equipe, que é o Josh and Alex, vão discutir sobre esses assuntos. Hello, Dominique. Thank you for spending your time and feel free to start the presentation and introduce Josh and Alex.
Thanks, Mazzi. Thank you very much for inviting RBR to be with you today, and thank you to everybody else for listening as well. RBR has actually been coming to Brazil for 13 years, and we love coming to Brazil because Brazil is unlike any other market around the world. And it gives RBR the opportunity to compare a market like Brazil with other countries that we research. I'm going to be joined today by two colleagues, so I'm going to ask them each to introduce themselves and then we'll get on with the main presentation. So first of all, Alex, could you perhaps introduce yourself?
Thank you, Dominic. My name's Alex Maple. I've been with RBR for over 7 years. I just want to echo what he said about what a pleasure it is to continue working with the TecBan. Obviously a shame that we can't come back out again to Brazil this year, but nevertheless, through the benefits of modern technology, we can still share insights and have this discussion about future trends in ATMs, cash, digital payments, etc. Josh?
Thanks, Alex. So my name's Josh Swarbrick. I've been at RBR for just over 2 years, and I'm in charge of research into Brazil, Portugal, and some other markets in Latin America like Peru and Mexico. And it's an absolute honour to be part of the team delivering the presentation to you guys today at TecBan. Again, such a shame that we can't be in Brazil this year, but espero poder viajar para São Paulo o ano que vem.
Thank you both. In the interest of time, I'm now going to move on with the presentation. And first of all, I'm going to introduce you what we're going to talk about today. And we have 3 sections for you. The first is ATMs and COVID-19. And this is going to look at the impact that COVID-19 has had on ATMs and branches and retail banking in general. Then we're going to talk about the ongoing trends in digital payments. And finally, we're going to talk about cashback. That's a hot topic in Brazil at the moment. The Central Bank of Brazil has taken a particular interest in cashback, but we're also seeing more interest in cashback in other countries around the world as well. So let's move on. What you can see on this slide is a case study from the UK. And there are 2 sets of data. We have data for 2020 and data for 2019. Also, there are coloured lines. The solid red lines is the number of transactions and the blue lines is the value of transactions. I'm actually going to show you a slightly different version of this slide now, which only shows the 2020 data. And it also has the dates on the x-axis, which makes it slightly easier to read. And what you can see is that initially in March, there was already a slight decline in the number of transactions. That was because people were already aware of some of the concerns around COVID-19 and their behaviour was already changing. They were reducing the number of cash withdrawals they were making. That really kicked in though later in March, when social distancing was encouraged and then when a formal lockdown was announced. And at that point, in late March and through early April, the number of cash withdrawals in the UK plummeted. You can see on the chart there, it fell by more than 50%. And I want to talk briefly about that 50% number because it's actually very relevant. Something that RBR gets asked a lot is how much might cash withdrawals, values and volumes fall in the future? And it's a very difficult question to answer because in many countries, the number of cash withdrawals is still growing, and even in countries where it's falling, it's only falling very slowly. But here we have a unique case study where the number has fallen by more than 50%. So maybe we have the answer to our question, which is that 50% is that magic number. It didn't drop by 60 or 70 or 80%, it only dropped by 50%, despite the fact there wasn't really anywhere for people to spend their money. Briefly on the rest of the chart, what we've seen since that period in mid-April is a gradual recovery in the number of cash withdrawals. But it's worth noting that even today, the number of cash withdrawals and the value of cash withdrawals is still well below where it was before the pandemic. Moving on, I want to briefly talk about some of the different characteristics we see in more developed countries versus less developed countries. I've already talked in more developed countries how there's been a very major impact on cash. That's partly because customers have been able to switch relatively easily to things like card payments and e-commerce. It's also because there are many people working from home. If you look at less developed countries, the situation is a little bit different. Some of those trends are clearly also applicable, but the economies of those countries are very different. For example, there's often more manufacturing, and typically manufacturing has to be done in person. There's also typically much less cards infrastructure. Fewer people have cards, people are less used to using cards, and e-commerce is less developed. And so typically, in these less developed countries, the value and volume of cash withdrawals has not fallen quite so dramatically. Okay, I want to change the subject slightly now and look at what RBR has seen, both in the short term and what we expect to happen more in the long term in terms of an impact from COVID-19. There's a number of things listed on this chart, and I'm just going to pick out a few examples to talk about now. Some of the things on the left in the short term are things you might expect, like greater use of cleaning of ATMs, cleaning of branches, changes in branch hours. Actually, many branches have often been closed as well. But one I want to talk about a little bit more is branch appointments. So many banks have moved to a situation where if you want to visit a branch, you must have an appointment. That's a major change from the past. Some customers might find that an inconvenience, but actually for banks it's quite interesting because for banks this is actually something they've been trying to do for a while. Banks have been trying to migrate routine transactions to self-service, such as ATMs and other self-service terminals. And what they really want to do then is reserve their interaction with customers to face-to-face transactions offering more value-added services, such as insurance, for example. Some of the other trends we've seen, more monitoring of ATMs, for example, and things you might expect, like the installation of screens in branches to divide self-service terminals or divide teller lines. So these are some of the short-term things we've seen. Longer term, we've seen a number of trends, some of which actually predate COVID-19, and many of which, in fact, we expect to continue beyond COVID-19. So really, what COVID-19 has done is accelerate some of these trends. So, for example, use of deposit and recycling ATMs. We've seen customers prefer to use self-service devices rather than going into a branch, either because the branch is closed or maybe they just don't want to go into the branch quite as frequently as they would have done in the past. Something that's very relevant to Brazil, we've seen greater use of contactless and biometrics. And again, I want to focus on the next one down on the right-hand side, which is video tellers. Something that's been around for a little while in the self-service world is the use of video banking, where through a self-service terminal, the customer can speak to an expert in the bank, but not necessarily in their branch. The take-up of this has historically been a little bit mixed, but what we are expecting to happen is that post-COVID-19, people will become more familiar with video technology, and as they become more familiar and more accepting of the technology, they might be more willing to use it for banking as well. So that's definitely a trend we expect to continue. And then a couple of other trends at the bottom there: more shared facilities, shared ATMs, shared branches, and also more cashback. And we actually are going to talk about cashback in a minute. Okay, that brings us to the end of this section. I'm now going to hand you over to Alex, who's going to talk about digital payments.
Thanks very much, Dominic. So this is the digital payments section. So the first slide we've got here talks about the different features that are going to accompany these new modern payment systems that are going to emerge. Now, just to say a quick word about the history of payment systems. So when we talk about these sorts of systems, where we think about credit transfers, for example, typically you might have a situation where you send a payment, but you don't know when it's going to arrive. Maybe it arrives a day late, maybe 2 days late. Maybe the payment system in question perhaps doesn't operate during certain hours, for example at the weekend. Maybe it doesn't operate. The great thing about these new faster payment systems that are emerging is that not only does the payment arrive within maybe a few seconds, perhaps typically less than 10 seconds, but also it'll be operational during most of the year. In fact, that's 7 days a week, 365 days a year, and it'll operate during all hours of the day as well. Now, what's really interesting about these new payment systems is the various features that also accompany them, because it's not just about the speed, it's also about the other things that they allow, the possibilities. So for example, if you look at the top left of the slide, you can see request to pay. Now, request to pay is a new type of feature which essentially allows merchants, telecommunications companies, all sorts of organizations to essentially send a message to a customer that can be replied to in the form of a payment. So for example, it could be a telecommunications company saying, this is a particular bill, this is how much you owe us, and then the person can actually look at that message and then reply with a payment. So that's a very, very neat feature of these systems that we're beginning to see come in. It's the sort of thing that's going to happen in the UK very soon, I think later in 2020. Payment through aliases. That's a very, very interesting new feature of these new payment systems. So in the past, maybe if you wanted to send a payment to your best friend, what you'd have to do is that you might have to take a very long bank account number or a sort code, and that's very clunky. It takes ages, you have to remember the number or you have to write it down. But in the future, that's going to be different. What you're going to be able to do is simply take maybe an email address, perhaps somebody's phone number, or maybe a tax ID number. There are different ways that you can actually use this information to actually send a payment. And that means that things can be done much easier, and it's a lot better to do it this way rather than just simply rely on these long bank account numbers. P2P payments, that's also a really important feature of these new types of payment system, making it easier for people to send money, not just to their friends, but also to companies and organizations. That's a very, very important element of these systems. And there's also some other neat features that are coming in different markets that we expect to be more normalized over the next few years. In the UK, there's a new feature that came in earlier this year called confirmation of payee. That's a really, really good feature, and it's a security feature. It means that when somebody wants to send some money to a friend, what they can do is that they can put that information into their banking app, and it checks that information against a database. So if I want to send Dominic some money, I put his name and number and details in, and it'll check that it really is Dominic who I'm sending that money to. That's a really, really good feature. Real-time payments at POS is also another useful feature, and it makes it much easier for customers in merchants, in shops, to send money real-time rather than using, say, for example, a card payment. And corporate payments are also very useful, as well. It increases the ease with which organizations and people can send money to companies. So these are some of the features that are coming in on these more advanced payment systems, and as you can see, there's at least 50 of these now emerging. Okay, so the next slide I want to talk about is this one, and this is about Hungary. It's a case study about what's going on in this particular country, and what's really interesting is that there are a couple of really interesting parallels with this country and Brazil. And one of them is the extent of cash payments, because compared to its neighbours in Europe, Hungary sees quite a lot of cash payments in relation to GDP. And one of the things that is very useful about these sorts of cashless payments through these new faster payment systems is the immediacy. When you pay someone in person with a banknote, they get that money instantaneously. But of course, with payment systems, that can be a challenge. Well, the faster a payment can be sent to someone, the quicker it can be registered in their banking app, and they can see that money straight there on their banking app straight away. That's really, really useful. Another thing that was really important in the Hungarian example was the question of regulation. And regulation is very important because one of the main problems with these faster payment systems is that they do tend to cost a lot of money. The upfront cost could be hundreds of millions of pounds. So there needs to be a system by which you can try to make market participants join the system. And one of the ways you can do this is to mandate that transactions of a certain type, of a certain, maybe under a certain value, sent electronically, have to be made through this system. It's one way that you can build up the volume of transactions, and the more transactions that can take part through this system, the lower the unit cost of each of those transactions. And that means that overall the cost of this new cashless payment system can go down. So it's another very, very useful lesson from the Hungarian example. One of the things that the central bank did was to extensively monitor the projects of the various market participants. And they did that to ensure that they were developing applications in line with the standards that they laid out. And one of those key standards is that everything has to be the same, it has to be open loop, it has to be interoperable. So all of the various organizations had to have a common data standard. And this data standard essentially meant that more organizations can join the payment system, and that's going to be a really useful feature going forward because you want more organizations to be part of this system and not fewer organizations. So that's the Hungarian example, and it's interesting as a lesson for Brazil because Brazil also has a situation where there is a high amount of cash in use. Okay, so let's go over to this next slide, and this is about WhatsApp payments. And I'm not going to talk for too long about this slide because this is a rather dynamic situation with WhatsApp payments being launched in Brazil, then being banned, and then seemingly being allowed again. But the key point here is that these large, very large, very mega internet companies like WhatsApp, like Google, Facebook, etc., these companies are going to move into the payment space. And I think one of the worries of the central bank, one of the worries they have is that these sort of systems will promote maybe a closed loop system where others cannot participate in the same way. But it looks as though Facebook and Google and these organizations are receptive to some of the concerns that regulators have, and it looks like they will allow others to participate in these systems. So it seems as though WhatsApp Pay can be part of the payments ecosystem and not be sort of siphoned off into an area which others cannot join. Another point to make there is also that WhatsApp payments is also going to be offered in Indonesia and Mexico, and we would probably expect those types of payments to be present elsewhere too. Okay, so let's have a look now at the Brazilian open banking regulations that have come in, and also the new payment system called Pix. Now, what's really interesting about Brazil is that they have copied a number of the things that are taking place in other countries. So, for example, there is very much an emphasis on trying to create a common standard where all of the organizations, the banks, register and along with established lines of how they're going to make everything open and interoperable. So there will be a common standard across various things, like there'll be a common QR code standard, for example. There'll also be things like payments through aliases, which I just mentioned. And there'll also be things like, for example, P2P transfers and the ability to pay bills and taxes and things like that. And the whole open banking regulations set here is really geared at trying to maximize the ability of fintechs to join this new payments ecosystem. Because one of the things that is happening in Brazil is that there's going to be a lot of fintechs joining the payment system, and it's important that banks share customers' data so that more fintechs are able to join in this new payment system. But one of the key and important things to remember here is that these fintech organizations, they're digital only and they don't have any branches, for example. So if a customer of a new fintech wants to have cash, they're still going to have to need those ATMs to get their money out. So even though there'll be more customers using these new fintechs, they will still need a way to get cash, and that's an important message there. All right, so that's the end of this particular section on digital payments. I'm now going to pass you over to Josh, who's going to talk about cashback.
Thanks, Alex. So I'm going to start by talking about what we would like to call probably traditional cashback or classic cashback. And what I mean by that is when you go into a store, or a customer goes into a store, makes a purchase, let's say, of £20. They then go to the till, they ask for £40 cash back, they will pay with their card, the transaction will go through as £60, and the cashier at the till will give the customer £40 in cash. Now, this was a concept that was brought in by the UK supermarket chain Tesco in the 1980s. And it was a very practical way for Tesco to reduce costs in terms of CIT, but it was also a very good way they could market themselves. So they marketed cashback as a service to their customers, and what we saw was an increased level of customer loyalty and sales with Tesco. And what we also saw in the UK was other supermarkets following suit once it proved to be so successful with Tesco. So it provides benefits to the merchants, but also to the customers. It's very quick, it's very convenient. Customers don't have to make a separate journey to an ATM or to a bank branch to get cash out. And it's a bit more secure. A lot of customers feel more secure in a supermarket. There's a lot of people. So compared to queuing up at an ATM, there's the added security. Now on this slide, we can see the trend of the use of cashback in the UK over the last 10 years. And what we can see here is there's been a big drop since 2012. Now, the interesting thing about this drop is why this has happened. So it's true in the UK, cash usage has declined, but in terms of cashback, this fall was really down to the supermarkets themselves. So previously, it was the case that the supermarket would promote the idea of cashback to the customer when they arrived at the till. But this is no longer the case. They are no longer promoting this. So it's not so much a fall in demand. It's more that the supermarkets themselves aren't pushing cashback as a service. So we've seen the decline since 2012. But what we're now seeing happening is a potential revival of cashback. Now, here in the UK, there's a current worry, and this predated COVID, of people's access to cash, namely free cash. So not using an ATM where you would have to pay a fee, for example. And both the industry and the authorities have identified cashback as a potential means to remedy this situation and to improve access to cash in areas of the UK where there might not be a bank branch or not a free-to-use ATM. So both UK Finance, the industry, and JAX, the authorities, have outlined cashback as an option for improving cash access. And it's not just these two bodies. We've also seen international card schemes, Visa and MasterCard. They've both put forward this initiative to provide incentives for merchants to provide cashback. So they will both be paying 12p per transaction for any cashback given on a transaction processed with a MasterCard or Visa card. So we've seen this revival of cashback in the UK. So that's what we call traditional classic cashback. I'm going to hand over to Dominic now, who will talk you through a few other options and some of the hardware that can be used for cashback.
Thank you very much, Josh. So Josh talked about traditional cashback, and I'm now going to talk about alternative forms of cashback. In fact, technically, they're not cashback at all. And on this slide, what we have is what we call cashless ATMs. Perhaps it's best to start with the photos on this page, where we have two terminals. They're two examples of a cashless ATM. On the left, we have an NCR terminal at First National Bank in South Africa. And on the right, we have a CAL retail teller machine, which is a terminal they deploy in a number of countries, such as in Southeast Asia. And if you perhaps look at that NCR machine, on the face of it, it looks like a regular ATM. You can see the card reader on the bottom right. You can see the PIN pad. There's actually a biometrics reader there as well. And there's also a big touch screen. But those of you with good eyesight can probably also see there's a message on the front of the machine which says no cash in device. And that's the key. This is an ATM that has most of the parts of an ATM, but no cash, and therefore no safe, and also no cash handling mechanism, no dispensing or deposit mechanism. That significantly reduces both the cost of manufacturing the ATM, but also the cost of running the ATM, because you no longer need to refill this machine with cash, because there is no cash in the machine. So how does it work? Well, typically you find this machine inside a small store. The customer goes in, they use the terminal just the same way they would use a regular ATM. They put their card in, they enter their PIN, they choose their transaction, but instead of receiving cash, they receive a receipt. And they then take that receipt, they hand it to the merchant, and then the merchant then gives them their cash. And why would you do this? This sort of terminal is great for locations which, for whatever reason, cannot support a regular ATM. Perhaps the number of transactions is too low to support an ATM, to justify an ATM. The business case is simply not there. Another problem sometimes is security. And people say that these ATMs are more secure because there is no cash inside the ATM. And at one level that's true. But what's actually happened is the security of the ATM has been, or security of the cash, should I say, has been transferred from the ATM to the merchant. So this is certainly a solution which we would expect to see more in countries such as Brazil, a very large country with some very remote areas, and almost certainly some locations which can't just justify traditional ATMs, but perhaps could justify this type of terminal. On this next slide, we've got a number of different devices, and I'm not going to spend a lot of time on this slide, but the real purpose of this slide is to say there is no one type of cashless solution. What you have here is a mix of different types of card reader, teller cash recycler. On the top right, there is a wall-mounted machine. And different countries and different organizations are configuring these devices in different ways, tailored to the local market. And just briefly, before we finish, I'm going to talk about a third type of cashback that we are now starting to see in different countries. On the left, there are two companies mentioned. There's a company called SoCash, which is based in Singapore and operates throughout Asia, and another company called Sonect, which is based in Switzerland. Both these companies are mobile apps. And the way they work is that you have the app on your phone, and if you need cash, you open up the app, you specify the amount of cash you would like, and a number of local retailers pops up on your screen where you can book that cash. You choose the merchant that's most convenient, you book the collection, a message then goes to that merchant, you then go to that merchant, which is typically only a short distance away, sometimes only a few hundred meters. You show your mobile phone to the merchant, they scan a QR code and they give you the cash. So this is quite similar to the previous example, but whereas in the previous example, The device was in the same location as the merchant. Now you've separated the device from the merchant. The device is your mobile phone, but the merchant is still the person giving you the cash. So cashback is a very interesting topic. We've seen different solutions here. Different solutions will be appropriate in different markets, but we certainly expect this to continue as different countries around the world are getting increasingly concerned about access to cash. That brings us to the end of the formal part of this presentation. I'm going to hand you back to Mazzy now, and then the three of us are more than happy to answer questions. Thank you very much for listening.
Well. Very good. Excellent presentation. Was wonderful. Thank you, Dominic. Thank you, Alex. Thank you, Josh. Now, the next part is about some questions that we are receiving. Pessoal, quem não enviou as dúvidas, quem quer enviar, nós vamos receber essas perguntas até o final do evento. Podem enviar aí pelo chat. O pessoal está recebendo aqui, selecionando. Eu já tenho algumas. E eu tenho uma nota aqui que eu fiz durante a apresentação e a primeira vai ser minha, ok? Dominic, the first one is mine, that I have had some notes that you was talking about your presentation, doing your presentation, and is about the effect that you point out, the pandemic. The pandemic has brought new trends and to the bank and the financial sector. In Brazil, we see a convergence between the physical and digital, such as open bank and payments. And we have more money in circulation, and that was created, has been created now a banknote, a new banknote. Do you think that the future of the sector, will you see this convergence gain importance?
Okay, that's a great question, and I'm going to answer it in a couple of different ways. The first thing to say is this idea that digital and physical are competing with each other is not quite right. What we see is that in countries such as Brazil, it's perfectly possible and perfectly normal for digital and physical to both grow at the same time. So that's the first part of the answer to that question. But I understand where the question is coming from, and it's certainly true that we are seeing growth in digital and growth in fintechs. And actually that's where TechBan plays a very important role, because these fintechs, they operate in the digital, but they need access to the physical. Almost all of these digital platforms at some point need access to the physical. And so you need an intermediary that links the two. TechBan is already doing that, and I expect that to continue into the future. So yes, this convergence will happen, but it doesn't just happen automatically. It needs people in the interface to make it work.
Thank you, Dominic, for the great answer. Let's start the first question that we receive. Well, Brazilians' relationship with ATMs is unique. In addition to common functions such as withdrawals and deposits, several other functions are part of the portfolio offered. Do you interpret this as a positive trend? Is it seen in other markets?
Yeah, I think that's a really good point, because what's interesting about Brazil is it's kind of at the forefront of ATM functionalities. So ATMs in Brazil quite often have lots of different options, as you mentioned, deposit, biometrics, lots of things like that. And it is true, we do see this in lots of other countries, and that's really the trend that we're seeing. So deployers are no longer adding more ATMs, they're rather refining their current fleets and adding more options for customers. I think maybe Turkey is probably a good example, where you have lots of deposit accepting ATMs, and they also offer lots of different services. So this is definitely a trend that we've seen in the last couple of years in other countries as well.
Thank you for the answer. Pessoal, fiquem à vontade em fazer perguntas, mandar as perguntas tanto em português ou em inglês. Nós temos uma equipe aqui que traduz, então por favor, fiquem à vontade, interajam. Nós estamos recebendo bastantes perguntas, inclusive eu tenho uma pergunta bem legal aqui. Well, the next question is, as the world prepares to get out of pandemic, which countries do you think can set an example for Brazil in terms of ATM market, new solutions, and physical digital convergence?
Yeah, I'll take this question. It's a good question, and what I would say is that there are a few examples globally of countries that are useful looking at with this question. I think India is actually quite a good example. It is a country which is a bit like Brazil in the sense that there are a large number of people in more remote areas who really like using cash, they like going to the ATM, they like using banknotes, but increasingly in urban areas we're seeing more use of digital payments. In India we have those two payment systems, IMPS and UPI, and people are using those in new ways to make digital payments. But nevertheless, it's a very, very cash-heavy country. There's a lot of people in rural areas. Over half of the country's population actually lives in these rural areas, and they very much favour cash. And that's a bit like with Brazil, where you have quite a lot of people who like using banknotes and coins. So we can expect that even though there's going to be this increase in the use of digital payments, we can also see that cash use is going to grow as well. And in these more remote areas, it may be that people can take banknotes out at ATMs, maybe there will be more IADs, maybe there will be different ways of getting cash back, for example. But yeah, as you can see, in many markets, it isn't just a case of one or the other, it's a case of both digital payments and also cash payments growing as well.
Thanks again for the answer. Pessoal, obrigado pelas perguntas, estão chegando bastante perguntas aqui. Enviem as suas dúvidas, aproveite essa oportunidade. E tem muitas interessantes aqui. Vamos lá, vamos para a próxima aqui. The next. Much has been said about the end of physical money. Do you believe that paper has become obsolete?
I'm smiling because this is a question that RBR gets asked very, very frequently. In fact, it's probably the question we are asked most often. And again, I'm going to answer it in a couple of different ways. I think, as you saw earlier in the presentation, in fact, there are still a lot of people who either depend on cash or prefer to use cash. So certainly cash for that reason will be around for a very long time. But there's another reason too, which is that even if you look at a country such as Sweden, where digital has made huge progress and cash usage is very limited, the government is actually very concerned now about that situation, and the government doesn't even want cash usage to fall any further. So I think for those two reasons, one is that there's still in many countries a lot of people using cash, and secondly because governments at some point get concerned if cash usage falls too low. I think yes, cash will still be around for a very long time to come.
Thank you for the answer. Let's start the next. With the decrease in number of the bank's branches, is the phenomenon of shared space, multi-banks, a trend that should gain prominence on your scenario? Should we see the same trend in Brazil?
Yeah, maybe I should take this one. I think that's definitely a possibility. I think it's something I wouldn't be surprised if we saw in Brazil. It's something we've definitely seen in other countries. Here in the UK, we've seen the creation of business hubs, shared business hubs of different banks. And also more recently in New Zealand, there were 6 banks there that have created a banking hub, a shared space with a multi-branded ATM. And I think, yeah, it's a trend we've seen with ATM pooling, and as you mentioned, the decrease in branch numbers. It's something that is a good way of cost savings. So yeah, it's something I would expect to see in Brazil.
Thank you again for the answer. Next question. In Brazil, do you think that the cashback option can work in distant places without so much access to traditional bank service?
Well, yeah, I think that's a really good point, because it's absolutely true. Yeah, it definitely can, because that's exactly what we've seen in the UK. As I mentioned, they've identified certain spaces where access to cash is much more limited, and it's a very good option as an alternative to setting up an ATM. And then Dominic also spoke about the different options you could have. So I think it is definitely a possibility to help improve access to cash in areas where that's a bit of a struggle.
Good. Thank you once again. And the next, based on your experience and research, what are the lessons that can be used to implement Open Bank in Brazil?
Oh, that's another very good question. Yeah, as I said earlier on, there are many different countries where we're going to see more use of open banking. We're going to see more interesting, more complex payment systems, and we're also going to see the use of APIs, which allow different organizations to have different applications on phones that can connect to this new payment system and provide all sorts of new ways of sending and receiving money. One of the key lessons I think that we found is that it's really important that different organizations share data. There's a whole new concept that it isn't the banks that own data, it's the customer that owns data, and the customer has to give permission for that data to be used. So if you're setting up a new payment system, a new payments ecosystem, you need to have a different culture, a culture where data is shared, where standards are open. For example, you might have a standard QR code. You have to have interoperability, and you have to have a system that is open loop. So I think one of the key takeaways from the things that we've been looking at is that things have to be standardized, they have to be open, and that allows more market participants to join these systems, allowing a lot more competition and a lot more choice for customers. But the key thing is this: as these organizations grow and as the number of fintechs grows, you're still going to find situations in developing countries like Brazil where these fintechs will still need a situation that allows customers to access cash. And so customers of those fintechs will still need to access ATMs. And I think that's one of the key things that we shouldn't forget.
Thank you, Alex, for the intro. Pessoal, o tempo acabou, infelizmente. Temos várias perguntas aqui a serem respondidas, elas serão respondidas posteriormente. Dominic, Alex, and Josh, I would like to thank you very much. The presentation was wonderful.
Thank you, Mazzy. It's always great to have the opportunity to share the findings from RBL's research, so thank you for inviting us here today. I also just want to say that it's very easy to forget the impact that banking and payments have on people's lives, and that makes this type of session all the more valuable. So again, thank you for giving us this opportunity. And finally, thank you to everybody that's tuned in for listening to us. We're sorry we're not with you in person, but hopefully we'll get to see you in person next year.
Once again, thank you. Pessoal, muito obrigado pela participação, obrigado pela audiência e até a próxima.